Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. It's a joy to be with you. We've got a lot to talk about. There's so much going on in the world. Let's talk about Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso and their leader, their president, Ibrahim Ibrahim Traore has just he's ignited the African diaspora, and I would say freedom lovers everywhere. People who have tried to break the yoke of colonialism wherever you call his name now, whenever you talk about the Sahel, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, people know that you have freedom on your mind. I've talked to Attorney Mark Fancher, some of my friends in Northern Ireland. They're pulling for President Traore. I've talked to people in South Africa. I've talked to people in India. I've talked to people everywhere. He's got everyone excited. And everyone except the West, everyone except France, the former colonizers. And those Africans and those people who've sought to break the yoke of colonialism have met the most unfortunate of ends. People who sought to bring peace to the world, they have met the most unfortunate of ends. When we look at Muammar Gaddafi was vilified in the West, but he was a hero to Africans the world over. Indeed, on the continent, he was really regarded as the strongest Black African leader. You got $50,000 when you're married. You could go to any school that you wanted to in the world, and the state would pay for it. He created a floor beneath which no person could fall. Poverty was something that they had removed from the lexicon in Libya. But they were also one of the three largest holders of solid gold in the world. They were also on the verge of uniting the African continent under one gold-backed form of currency. And the West couldn't have that. And so while coming in under the white flag of surrender, it is very important for us to note that President Gaddafi, had surrendered himself to the West. While he was riding in under the white flag of surrender, that is when we killed him. It sounds awful because it is. Patrice Lumumba sounds awful because it is. We just keep on going down the list. Samora Michel. We had just met him, Attorney Mark Fancher. We'd been with him in August, just before he'd been killed. And he and my father got on so well through a translator. They talked literally into the wee hours of the morning. And his people said, we've never seen him this excited. And I have to tell you, my brother Jesse and I looked at each other and we said to them, we've not seen our father this excited. And the words that they could say to each other, freedom fighter, as they poked each other in the chest and hugged. And then he was killed. The South African government hated him. He crashed at a mountain not too far from South Africa. And guess what, Attorney Fancher? The rescuers from South Africa heard them crying, begging for help. And they waited on the mountainside until they heard them cry no more. Oh, it's been awful. The wretched of the earth. But something is happening now. And so let's talk about what's happening in Burkina Faso, because Ibrahim Traore and the other members of the Sahel are coming up with something different. And of course, now, one of the things that Gaddafi did was oppose AFRICOM, the American military presence on the continent. And he was the leader who kept AFRICOM off the continent. When you took him out, then AFRICOM was able to get in. Oh, Mark Fancher, it's just so much. I'm so full. So when you reached out to me today, I said, wow, there are a lot of people who need to know about this, but a lot of folks don't really understand Africa and the countries on the continent, how wealthy they are, and how Europe is still and the United States are still trying to keep a grip on Africa. Russia and China have different deals with Africa. That's why I said Ukraine wasn't going to work, because they have different relationships. They do. So let's talk about this General Langley. a black man from the United States. Um, but let's go back to Burkina Faso and what is happening over there. What's happening in Mali? What's happening in Niger? And then maybe that will help us to get a better frame for uh, General Langley's remarks. Attorney Fancher?
Yeah, this is a continuation of a story that began when the first African was kidnapped from Africa and enslaved. Uh, we know that humanity first emerged on the continent of Africa, and it stands to reason that God would bless that continent with extraordinary natural resources. I mean, because that's where his children first began to build civilizations and to thrive and to live. And so obviously, he would want that place to be very rich. But unfortunately, as people began to migrate and as Europe found that it could not be self sustaining and self sufficient, and that it would need to reach out into other parts of the world, it embarked on a generations long campaign of conquest, enslavement, genocide in order to satisfy the needs of Europe and later the broader West. And we know about the institution of slavery and the way that it depopulated, in many ways, the African continent. But at a certain point, that the actual extraction or removal or kidnapping of people from Africa came to an end, not for benevolent reasons, but because of economic ones. And Europe's gaze never left Africa. Although it was no longer taking human beings out, it did see that Africa offered enormous opportunities to extract natural resources, mineral resources, and timber and other things from the continent. And so all of the European countries began to try and establish a foothold on the African continent that they could use for purposes of colonization and exploitation. And at a certain point, the European countries decided, we're all scrambling for Africa, and there's no need for us to do this. This continent is enormous. And in 1884, the latter months of it, and into early 1885, they all convened, representatives of the European countries convened in Berlin. And effectively, what they did is they took a map of Africa and they carved it up as though they were carving up a birthday cake. And they gave each country a slice. They gave France a slice. They gave England a slice. They gave Portugal a slice. Each European country, Belgium got the choice
Mhm.
slice in the Congo. They all got a piece of it. And from then on, they began to colonize and exploit it. And they used different methods in order to do that. One of the primary ways in which they did it, which occurred naturally, was the balkanization of Africa. In other words, there were established nations and communities and groups that were living together in Africa, and in order to make sure that they stayed within the limits that had been established at the Berlin Conference, they started constructing these borders and creating new countries that had never existed before. And the end result of that sometimes was the dissection of entire nations of peoples. So you might have one group, the Malinke might live in this area and in this area, but they cut them right in half, and then say you no longer are living with your group. Now you must join with this other group that you may not have gotten along with before. And the byproduct of that was, tensions within these new countries, which the colonizers thought was just great, because from the beginning the effort was to divide and conquer. And
Well,
and
well,
so
look, but I think it's important for us to understand, for people to understand that they stoked them. These artificial lines would divide a formerly united nation of people, a tribe of people. So this was very deliberate. Yes.
yes, it was. Yes, it was.
And I'm just trying to help us to wrap our minds around this, because you will go through the continent as you and I have done, and you'll see people who look alike because they're family, but they've been divided from each other. I think we understand that. That's some familiar territory for us. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. And it was so nefarious because you're already dealing with a population that had been weakened by slavery. You know, some of its strongest and most intelligent people had been pulled out of the continent, and many of the people left behind were not necessarily in a position to function as warriors or defenders. And not only that, they'd been chased. So that you had established societies and civilizations in Africa that once the slave trade began, and slave raiders were coming in, people had to abandon, the cities and towns that they lived in order to retreat into the bush to avoid capture. And so their lifestyle evolved away from being these advanced civilizations sometimes to being people, communities of people that were living basically a subsistence kind of existence. They're just trying to survive, and so it became easy to overcome them. And I think that's important to note because so many people wonder, well, how and why was Europe able to overcome, these people? If you went into Cambridge, Massachusetts, you have lots of brilliant people there, brilliant people, but a strong military force that went in to attack would probably have no trouble, no matter how brilliant they are, because the people aren't oriented toward war. And
Hmm.
many African communities were not oriented toward war and defense. And so they were easily overcome. And then for those that were, they did not always have the same world perspective that the invaders had. So it was easy to overcome them too. So you could go into one community and you could say, we were over in the neighboring community and we heard that they're preparing to come attack you. Oh, we get along great with them. Why are they going to do that? We don't know, but we think that they're arming and they've got guns, not knowing that these people had just left guns in that village. He said, if you don't believe it, go send scouts over and take a look. And they go and they see, oh, they do have guns. And so they said, well, we better give you some too so that you can fight and defend yourselves. Yeah, give us the guns. And they set them at war against each other. I mean, these types of things were, played themselves out so that they were very weak. So colonization lasted only so long. But eventually, Africa pulled itself together, was able to organize and mobilize, and it began a long process of decolonization. And this really came to a head in or about 1945, when many people from Africa convened in Manchester, England, and they began to talk in terms of a unified Africa, coming together as an Africa that stood together against the colonizers. And it coincided with World War II. And so, as Europe's attention was focused more on the World War and less on Africa, it gave an opportunity for Africa to really, really put together some resistance movements, which eventually succeeded. That Ghana liberated itself in 1957, I believe, and then many countries began to become independent in quick succession after that. What Europe did was to understand that their interest was less about trying to control Africa's domestic politics than it was in trying to make sure that they had continuing domination of Africa's wealth and resources. And so, as this wave of independence began to sweep Africa, the West began to make it a priority to make sure that whoever was the designated head of state for each African country was someone who was going to be their puppet. And these were people who were sometimes not only compliant with the wishes of Western powers, but sometimes they were even vicious and corrupt dictators and oppressive forces themselves. and they began to exploit their own people and began to put the nation's wealth in their own, accounts, offshore accounts, and other things. And they ruled with an iron hand. We begin to call this concept neo-colonialism, which basically refers to the fact that even though the colonizer has picked up and left, that they still control the African country through a proxy, through somebody who's functioning on their behalf. And so neocolonialism in this form worked very well for a very long time until Africans, yet again, became wise to it and began to come after these neocolonial leaders and began to agitate for real revolutionary change.
Well, hold on, because if I could come here, because at that same time, in that post 1945 period, many of them started coming to black colleges. And, in Kruma, the Talberts. I mean, when I think about the people who my parents met again in the 70s and 80s and 90s, or at the end of the 60s, people they had gone to college with, or people who had, starting in that period after the Manchester meeting, they didn't just go to the predominantly white institutions, they very intentionally came to black colleges. Before we continue, why do you think that was?
Well, I think they probably all had their own reasons for doing that. But I do know that in the case of Kwame Nkrumah, he uh, really was a sponge for many of the ideas which had been bouncing around in the African diaspora for some time with respect to Pan Africanism. And so he went to Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, and he had the opportunity to meet with and study with any number of people who influenced his thinking. And by the time he went back to Ghana, he was armed and ready intellectually and ideologically. And the one thing that he was absolutely convinced about was that there was no future for Africa if they continued to stay within these boundaries, within these borders that had been established by the European colonizers. That what they had to do was to unite the entire African continent under one flag, and that it had to stand strong together against the external forces that were trying to exploit Africa. And when he began to push this idea constantly, then he was one of the first to become targeted by the West. This was a very potent concept. The West has known from the beginning that this is the beginning. If ever Africa unites and stands strong and firm against foreigners coming in and taking Africa's wealth, then the entire Western world and the entire Western economy is threatened and may collapse. And so the CIA in particular, became very busy in trying to undermine not only Nkrumah, but anybody who listened to his ideas. So that when Nkrumah was on a diplomatic mission to Southeast Asia, through a well-crafted and carefully executed plan, the CIA and its operatives and others came into Ghana and took the country,
Mhm.
and really prohibited him from getting back in. He never was really able to go back and live in Ghana again. But one of his comrades, Sekou Touré,
Mhm.
in Guinea, took him in and made him a co-president. And so he spent his last years writing about and arguing in favor of United Africa. For his part, uh, Sekou Touré and Kwame Nkrumah had at some point formed an alliance, and they said we're going to start a united Africa as at least between our two countries. Um, and so that never really materialized. Patrice Lumumba,
Mhm.
who was the first African leader for Congo, which is regarded as Africa's prize. There is probably no more mineral rich piece of territory or real estate in Africa than the Congo. And when he started talking about Africa, taking Africa and its wealth for itself, speaking favorably about the East and Eastern Bloc countries,
Mhm.
and working with them, then not only was he targeted just by CIA lowly agents, but there are records of President Dwight Eisenhower
Yes.
having a meeting with Allen Dulles in the Oval Office about how to assassinate Patrice Lumumba. And they even devised a plan for how they were going to get an agent up close to him so that he could put poison in Lumumba's toothpaste,
Mhm.
and poison him that way. That plan was never carried out because they had an alternative method that was carried out by some other stooges. And in the wake of his death, Mobutu Sese Seko, a
Mhm.
brutal dictator,
Mhm.
uh, took control of Congo and performed wonderfully for the West. Let them come in and rape and rob the Congo blind.
Mhm.
And what they didn't take, Mobutu took for himself
Mhm.
and stashed away in offshore bank accounts and things. So there was this pattern of identifying those leaders who were going to stand up against the West, uh, vilifying them, demonizing them,
Mhm.
and then taking them out. And there are any number of other examples I could give, but we can fast forward to Muammar Gaddafi,
Mhm.
who, as you said at the outset, began to talk about the fact that Africa could become totally independent economically and otherwise. And he was already doing it in his own country. Some years ago, back in the early 1980s, I believe, Chris Wallace, the journalist, had
Yes.
gone to Libya and had just moved among the common people. And he was walking down a residential street with these enormous houses. I mean, huge. I mean, we would call them mansions. And he said, believe it or not, these are the homes of the most humble working people in this country.
Mhm.
That what Gaddafi has done is he's taken much of the oil revenue that comes into Libya and he's divided it among the many so
Absolutely.
that everybody has a very high standard of living in this country. And what he was advocating was, as you said, establishing an independent African gold backed currency, which would have the effect of devaluing the French franc and probably the US dollar as well. And so if you look,
Because it would be a gold backed currency. We have a fiat currency. It's backed by nothing. We just print money. That's all we do. And we've been on the petrodollar, which the world is moving away from now. And we're beginning to see that as we look at President Trump and we're putting all these changes on him. No, 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 no. It's much bigger than that, Mark Fancher. It's much, much, much bigger. And that's why I went into just, I touched upon the Gaddafi assassination because it was much more. Um, that was a really, really big, big hit that the continent took. And they were devastated that it happened on the watch of the first black president. Yes?
yeah, I mean, I don't make any excuses or apologies for Obama. I mean, he was
Mhm.
an enthusiastic participant in many
Mhm.
of the attacks on Africa. And there are the infamous Hillary Clinton emails that so much has been made about. Um, you can go to the State Department's website and read them. And within that collection of emails are a number of them from her staff to people in France who are talking in very frank terms about Gaddafi. And there are emails that say quite explicitly that we have to take him out. They say that what we need his oil, and we need to stop the development of this independent Pan African currency.
Mhm.
It will ruin the franc. So they talk very frankly about it, and I won't go into all of the details uh, about his death, but not only did they kill him, but it was done through disembowelment with a
Mhm.
bayonet.
In
And
public,
yes,
and then they made the leader of the nation, the father of the new Libya, he had to lie in state without having been embalmed. And that's how the people had to see him as he began to decompose.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, and of course, Hillary Clinton famously said what?
Yeah, they asked her about it, and she said, "Well, we came, he died. Ha 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 ha."
We came, we saw. Yeah.
That's right, and he died.
Whew. And it was on camera. She was in the middle of an interview and she got the message that he had been killed. And they filmed it. That's what's so awful. As he was begging for his life, and he was like, you know, don't. And but he had also said that when he saw where we were going politically, because there was so much hope when President Obama was first elected, when he saw that this was more of an establishment agenda, he did say publicly that he felt that he would be killed. He said, "I don't think that I will make it through my term." You do recall that, Mark?
Hmm.
I mean, I just I mean, as we move into Burkina Faso, before we even get there, I think it's important for us. What you're doing, I think, is brilliant by helping us to see what just happened, right? What just happened. I mean, he was the bulwark against AFRICOM. Yes, he
Yeah.
was the one who said, "No, we don't want you in here," and the other African leadership followed. Oh boy, it's a lot.
And I think we really have to understand the game that's played, because the game that they play is, if you do what we want, then we will turn you into the world's greatest and most wonderful hero. If you don't play the game, then we will just as quickly turn you into the world's worst villain and monster.
But didn't
And
Samora Michelle say, "If the West speaks well of me, know that I have already betrayed you"? Oh,
that's powerfully true.
I told you we had to talk about this today because this is on my heart. Because I mean, because I think this is such an important time, and Mark, you and I are on the same page on so much. People don't know, and Africa is still, it's not the dark continent, but it's the darkened continent. So much happens undercover there, and it's the richest continent, and we don't even know, Mark.
Yeah. And there's so much we can know if we just pay attention. I mean, so
Mhm.
look at the trajectory of Gaddafi's career. At a certain point, when he was in line with Arab nationalists and with African nationalists, then there was no worse villain in the world than Muammar Gaddafi. I mean, even Ronald Reagan went and bombed his house, killed his daughter. I
Killed
mean,
his daughter.
and this was, he was terrible. But then there was a brief period when Gaddafi was cooperating with the West, particularly with returning people who were suspected of hijackings and other things. And all of
Mhm.
a sudden, he was the world's greatest African leader. You look at the media and they said, "Oh, he's just magnificent and wonderful." He starts talking about the United States of Africa and becoming independent. Now he's a villain again, and we've got to get NATO to go in there and take him out. And they've done the same thing with Robert Mugabe.
Mhm.
Robert Mugabe initially was Africa's greatest leader. He started talking about reclaiming land that had been stolen by Europeans. All of a sudden, he's the worst monster there is. So when we see what's happening in Burkina Faso, it fits within that historical context.
Mhm.
When this Michael Langley character comes along and starts talking about Ibrahim Traore being this great threat to his people, then we have to dismiss that immediately and say, what are his people saying and what are his people doing? They
Well,
have,
let's go back. Who is Michael Langley and who is Ibrahim Traore?
okay, well, it, Michael Langley is of little consequence because he's the latest, bug dancing Negro that they have gotten to head the United States Africa Command. And AFRICOM, for those who don't know, our U.S. Africa Command, was established for the purpose of having U.S. military, a U.S. military presence in Africa without it looking like there's a U.S. military presence in Africa. It's a bad look. The optics of having the United States military occupying Africa just doesn't look good. And so what they do is they have these so-called advisors strategically positioned throughout Africa to direct Africa's armies in these operations, which are intended to lock down Africa and its resources for the benefit of the West. So Langley is one of the guys that helps to coordinate this, and they've opportunistically used black people to play the role of the head of this. The first one when they first created AFRICOM, there was a guy named William Kip Ward, who was a black man who was the first public face of AFRICOM, and anybody that plays that role, either they're idiotic or they're traitors to their people, because the U.S. military can do no good for Africa. And so he has publicly stated recently, his rhetoric has been that Traore is this great threat. But again, you have to know what precedes that. And the story really doesn't begin in Burkina Faso. The story really begins in Niger, in that region, because Niger has the uranium, vast reserves of uranium that France has really depended on to power France. And so they've got extensive operations in Niger, where the French military has made it its business to make sure that it has a heavy presence in Niger to make sure that there's no threat to these operations that are there. And the people in Niger have said, we're done with this. We don't want to have the French so heavily occupying our country. And so they drove out the neo-colonial puppet that was overseeing it, a man named Mohamed Bazoum. They threw him out of the country. And when they did that, France had a fit. And then the US, which has been basically sort of helping France along, said they had a fit too. And so they got together and they started threatening the people of Niger. And they said, if you don't return Bazoum to power, then we're coming in there and we're going to get you. And when they said that, Burkina Faso and Mali said, oh, not so fast. Basically, if you come in here and you militarily attack Niger, you're going to have to deal with Mali and you're going to have to deal with Burkina Faso too. And our people know what the deal is, and we're already out in the streets in the thousands and the tens of thousands and the hundreds of thousands, ready to take you on. And to make a long story short, when they saw that unity between those three countries, France and the US backed down. I mean, they huffed and they puffed, but basically they never attacked. And when that happened, that sent shockwaves throughout the continent of Africa, because people were not accustomed to seeing the bully back down in that way. I mean, the West had been bullying Africa, shoving it around, pushing it around for generations. And here, these three little countries get together and they say, we dare you to come in here and try and take over. And the US and France backed down. That fired the imagination of freedom-loving people throughout the continent. And that's what makes Traore so dangerous, because he is the perfect icon for resistance. I mean, he's young and charismatic and strong and straight backed and straight talking, and he's up in their face if necessary, and he tells them just get out and don't come back, and people love that, and so that makes him a very dangerous individual.
And I love it. I mean, but to hear, and I think it's while Michael Langley General Langley. Um, he's consequential in that he is someone who is, we have the black faces in high places who are taken, who are now the faces of empire, Mark Fancher. And so, under the cover of darkness, if you will, and pun intended, but I choose my metaphors carefully, so much wickedness is done because he was so forthright in this meeting in threatening President Traore. Anyone could read in between, you don't have to read in between the lines. When you start saying that someone is a threat to their people, Gaddafi, that they're stealing the resources for themselves, Gaddafi, even though that is what Mobutu was doing. That is what these Western puppets are doing. They stand really at the gate and hold the gate open so that the European and Western powers can go in and steal everything. So what they're trying to do is undermine him. I think that we've grown to the point where people are saying, no, not only do we not believe you, you do need to leave. In fact, you don't need to come here. And so I want to know, because I think it's important for us in the West, particularly as Black Americans, because we still celebrate the first Black to do this, the first Black to do that. We do that, Mark. As if the first Blacks that we see after having been here more than 400 years are the brightest that we've ever seen. No, they're the first ones with the opportunity. And it's a system, as you remind us, that they created. They didn't create it for us. They created it for themselves. And so they select, not we might elect, no, they select people who undermine our interests. So I could not help but see him. I mean, because his comments went viral. And I just need you to explain that because this has ignited a conversation all around the world because now they are talking about the black leaders are the who are the puppets of empire, and they're beginning to dig down into the history, into the culture, and a lot of people who we have celebrated, who we have admired, who we say this is what we want our children to grow up to be. That now more and more black people in the United States and certainly around the world are saying, I don't think so. Help me with that.
Yeah, I mean, the people who should be most celebrated are usually the people who have been most attacked and vilified by the West, and it's all about power
Yeah.
because what the West is so afraid of, and let me be more specific: world capitalism and
Hmm.
imperialism. What they're so afraid of is what would become not just of Africa, but African people globally, if ever this idea of African unity really took hold. Because so up to now, the superpowers in this country have either been European or Asian.
Hmm.
There has never been an African superpower. But if Africa were to unite as one country, then it would become not only the first Black superpower, but it would become the largest and most dominant superpower because nobody could compete with Africa in terms of its natural wealth, in terms of its strategic position, in terms of even the role that we play as African people in this hemisphere, its global reach,
Hmm.
its population, because of everything that Europe did, is now dispersed throughout the world. There are African communities all over the world. And so you could never attack Africa and think that by attacking that piece of real estate that you're going to take it out. Because once you try and do that, then you've got communities of African people throughout the world who are ready to attack you in the belly of the beast. You know, that makes even the enemies of Africa vulnerable because within their very bellies are the children of Africa.
Hmm.
And so it's a very potent kind of a thing, and it's why don't want to take us on a tangent, but it's one of the reasons I've been so concerned about this growing acceptance of the idea of foundational Black Americans and
Hmm.
American descendants of slaves, because that works against what is our greatest strength, and that is global African unity. That's what makes us such a threat and makes us so
Hmm.
potent. And if Africa were to come together, I mean, the resistance many times is, well, they don't like us. Even if Africa came together, they wouldn't help us because they don't like us. They think that they're superior to us. None of that is true. But let's assume for the moment that it is, that Africa,
Well,
the
some
people,
of them have been lied to,
oh,
and
many,
those who are clear will say that.
oh, yeah,
I mean, but it is because Reverend Jackson has been going to Africa for more than 50 years and got a chance to see this and make the connections between the people he had gone to school with, who he was seeing again, who were running their country. He said, wait a minute. Everybody in America is tied to Italy, England, Greece. Every, all, they are, and they are proud. But guess what? Guess what? Black people need to be tied to Africa. We didn't just sprout up here. We have a mother continent, and you know what? We won't be strong until Africa's strong, and Africa won't be strong until we are.
yeah. And let's assume, just for the sake of discussion, like I said, it's not true, but let's assume that Africans really hate us. I mean, they don't want anything to do with us. Just assume that for the moment.
Okay, okay.
And they were able to consolidate Africa into one country, even if they never lifted a finger to help us. Those of us in the diaspora, those of us in the United States, if they never lifted a finger, the mere fact that they're that strong and that they're such a dominant superpower would carry over and impact our reality in the United States and in other countries just automatically,
How?
because of the perceptions and the fears and the concerns that even though they don't look like they like each other, maybe they do. And if we offend these African descended people in North America, then maybe Africa itself will not like that, and they'll cut off our access to their oil
Mhm.
or to their chromium or their cobalt or their gold or their manganese or whatever it is that they have. And so we better take good care of our African descended population. We better not offend them. We better not attack them. We better make sure that nothing happens to them, because we don't want to even risk the possibility of Africa's wrath. And you see that. See, there are other populations that understand this basic thing. That's why for so long Zionists have fought so hard to preserve Israel,
Mhm.
because they've recognized that as their leverage. As long as Israel plays such a pivotal role in Western imperialism, then people who are, associate as Jews or who live, or identify as Jews wherever they are in the world, they might not even like Israel. They may be anti-Zionist, but you can be awfully sure that people in power are not going to take a risk by offending people who are Jewish anywhere for fear of what the implications are for their relationships with Israel.
But stay right there because they have a land, they have a country. See, we keep thinking that this is a religious fight. It is not. This is a political fight in the Middle East. It's about land, it's about resources. That's what this is. All of this kumbaya, and I certainly do know that people might be rubbed one way or another about how people worship, but people, not really. People don't really care about that. This is a political fight, everybody. And what we're seeing in Burkina Faso, and when you're watching, I mean, my goodness, if Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso can come together, what if that spreads? What does that mean, Mark?
Oh, it means power is what it means, because Israel is a tiny little country, relatively speaking, with limited resources. And look at what it does for the world Jewish population. You
Mhm.
know, they, in the name of fighting anti-Semitism, Trump goes down and threatens to defund Harvard University in the name of anti-Semitism. That's power. I mean, he's not serious about it. He could care less about anti-Semitism, but because of the implications of it, and the Zionist campaign that has been waged for so long in support of Israel, etc., then you can't offend, you can't do anything that's perceived as anti-Semitism
Mhm.
without consequences. And so you can't, if Africa becomes united, then you won't be able to do anything that's perceived as anti-Black or anti-African because of the consequences or the potential consequences. And so I've laid out this scenario with the hypothetical, the false hypothetical that Africans don't feel any connection to us and would not do anything to us. But that's not true. They do see and feel a connection to us. And because they do, just imagine just how much solidarity there would be, how much support there would be,
Mhm.
and how many resources which would become available to the African diaspora if Africa is in control of itself. And
But
so,
when you think of Hugo Chavez, what people don't realize is that he identified with Black people. He said, because my family's Black. We don't, most Black people who were brought to the Americas were not brought to the United States. They went to South and Central America and the Caribbean. Jamaica is a land of indigenous people, but they didn't survive. The Black people did. We're not indigenous to Jamaica, we're indigenous to Africa. And I agree with you on the whole thing about the foundational Black American. And I get it. I get it. And I certainly fight for the ancestors whose blood is in the soil here. I do, Mark. But I do know that W.E.B. Du Bois is buried over in Ghana. And when my parents took me there when I was 7, they made certain before we went to the castle where you had the point of no return.
mhm.
We first stopped at W.E.B. Du Bois' grave. And I didn't know as a child, as a 7-year-old, just what that meant to me and what it was going to mean. But we took pictures there. And I remember asking my parents, because I'd heard of Du Bois. My brother's middle name is Du Bois, after W.E.B. Du Bois. I said, why would he be here? And my mother said, America, America pushed him away. And it pushed Paul Robeson away. Although Paul Robeson was back, he never recovered. And how ironic, Jackie Robinson, one of the greatest icons America has ever produced, his son David is in Africa living and working and developing. And so Charlene Hunter Galt, another icon, working, thriving in South Africa. More and more of us are going back. I have a lot of classmates from Howard, like 4 or 5 I can name off the top of my head. My father came back from a trip because he's been there so many times. He said, do you know I bumped into your friend Michael and then your friend Nikki? And did it? I said, oh, wow, they are living over there. He said, oh, yeah. And they were wondering why you weren't over here with us because he said, I remember them when you were in school. So there's something going on, Mark. I mean, I know our time is short today, but I mean, why did you think it was important for us to talk about this? Because we were going to talk about something else. And when you sent me the article, I said, oh, I've been waiting to talk to someone about this because everything that I can retweet and put out there about Ibrahim Traore, I do it because I support him and I'm so hopeful. And he has had everyone so many assassination attempts. Now, let's be very clear, Mark.
Mhm.
He is a marked man today,
Yes.
today. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that. We shouldn't be afraid, but we've got to acknowledge that he is someone and the world is watching, particularly those in the African diaspora. We are saying, wait a minute, don't you touch him. Don't touch him. But Ibrahim Traore is surviving assassination attempts. I mean, serious attempts. And I'm just praying for him. Why is this such an important story for us, particularly right now, as we're watching the world, Mark, be reorganized?
Well, as you said, the threat is real, and they took out one of his predecessors, Thomas Sankara,
Oh boy,
who was trying to do the same thing that he's doing.
who was also
And
very, very young.
yes, so I think that it's important now because we need to recognize the value of this moment. This is when the African world needs to stand together. He is an icon. He is a symbol of what can happen if we unite. And it's the wrong time for us to be saying that, well, they're not us and we're not them and we are our own people and all of that. No, we are all one people. In the same way that we were all one people when they snatched us from here and there and the other place in Africa and put us all on one ship, we all spoke different languages, but we recognized right away, okay, circumstances have now made us one people. We are one tribe, no matter where we come from in Africa. And now, wherever we may live in the world, if we're African descended people, then we're Africans. And we have to recognize that. And it is our opportunity. The opportunities for us to unite and to back down, to make the West back down, to make imperialism and capitalism back down, those moments are rare. And this is one of them. And there are times when we are at our best, when we see the door to freedom open just a little bit and we charge through it. But there are other times when we don't have the sense of a dog. And what I mean by that is that you can take a dog into a room and you can beat that dog, you can abuse that dog, you can do whatever you can imagine to hurt that dog. And if you open up the door to that room just to crack, that dog is gone. We are the only people who, at times in our history, we've been beaten, we've been abused, we've been exploited, and we've been oppressed. And they've opened up the door nice and wide, and we said, "No, we ain't going nowhere. We're gonna stay right here."
Wow. Malcolm talked about it. We's Massa, how's we doing today? I can be bleeding, can have no shoes. Well, oh, we's okay. We's all right.
Yeah,
And
I
felt
ain't
like,
no African. I ain't no African. I'm an American. I'm
oh
an
my
American.
gosh.
Yeah, I know you're
Oh,
abusing me, you're exploiting me, but I'm an American. I don't want Africa. I don't know nothing about Africa.
and that's what I saw with Mr. Langley, with General Langley. And it made me very sad. And I'm praying for Ibrahim Traore because we really need his example. But I tell you what, he's already inspired a new generation. So as Dr. King said, it doesn't matter much what happens to me now. I've been to the mountaintop and I've seen the promised land. Y'all are going to get there. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but you're going to get there. And no matter where we are in the world, whenever you see a black person, you could be walking down the streets of Paris. You kind of point at each other and you acknowledge each other, and it really is. It makes you feel very warm, because it makes you feel connected. Because we all know that we all had the. I think underneath it all, Mark, we all know that we had the same journey to get here, wherever we are, dispersed in the world, because that's what the diaspora is. We're just dispersed. But when we see each other, we go, "It's good to see you. It's good to see you." What thought do you want to close out with today?
Well, building on that, I just want people to recognize that when we hear hostile things from our sisters and brothers, when they say things that are ignorant, when they say things that make us feel badly, or we take them the wrong way, remember that that's not necessarily coming from them. That sometimes, and if not most times, they're reacting to a carefully designed plan to make them say that about us and to think that about us. Don't think that the images and the messages and the popular culture out of the United States that goes into Africa portrays us in our best light. They send into Africa the worst images, the
Absolutely.
things that make us look the absolute worst. And you can't fault Africans in Africa for thinking badly about us if all that they've gotten is a steady diet of the worst portrayals of who we are. They all think that we're Diddy. And then by the same
And
token,
wait, when I went to Africa in 1971, Mark, soul to soul, when black people still owned Stax Records and Motown, there was so much pride. When they sent Wilson Pickett, who was a Stax artist, when they sent the Emotions, Roberta Flack was there. I mean, this was the best of us. Carlos Santana, who acknowledges his Africanness, he was on that trip too. The Voices of East Harlem, which was a very popular group when we were children. You remember them.
yeah,
You know, it's when that's why we have to be very careful about all of these billionaires we're celebrating. These are people who had their money given to them.
yeah. And on the flip side, we got to be really careful and on the alert, because what they will tell us about Ibrahim Traore in the weeks and months to come is that he's a horrible person,
Yeah.
that he's a butcher, that he's a dictator, that he is a criminal. They'll tell us all of these things. And so we can't take the bait. We can't swallow that without analyzing it and just assume that because they say it, it's true. Because then we start saying negative things about him and about African people when we really shouldn't. We got to stand together, one African family, standing together, united, we'll be triumphant. Victory is certain.
The struggle continues, and if you continue with the struggle, victory is certain. Attorney Mark Fancher, my brother beloved, thank you so much for this today. I feel, as James Brown says, I feel good. I love it. Thank you so much, everybody. And pray for the people of Burkina Faso and Niger and Mali and all over the world. In particular, so many people have put so much energy into President Ibrahim Traore, and do that because he is working so hard, not just for the people of Burkina Faso. He's working for all of us, really. When he wins, we will all win. AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota, the Santita Jackson Show. God bless.